in some senses, the title of this panel is Concept into Form, but I think the way that I work, or the way I like to think that I work, is the opposite, that it's form into concept. And so I like to start with really abstract divisions of the canvas and to see how, in a kind of call and response manner, how the relationships that are developing start to evoke a narrative or a particular kind of poetry that I want to follow. And so when I'm starting a piece, I really try to enter into a kind of pre-verbal place where I'm not naming what I'm making, because the second I know, or if I know too early on what the image is that I'm creating, I lose interest. And so a huge part of my process is setting up obstacles to make it difficult for myself to figure out what the heck I'm painting. And so some of those obstacles might be if a figure starts to develop in a very particular gesture or pose early on, I may do something that completely obliterates or obstructs that gesture in order to really rethink what's happening. In some ways, though, when I hear myself say that, I think, oh, that's kind of a romantic, maybe, notion that I'd like to think I'm doing, because I think that there are some parameters that are givens for me, like that there's a very good chance that there's going to be a figure present. Because I think for me, the figure is the reason for the work. That there is, you brought up the idea of risk, and I love that. That without the figure there, as abstract as I might want it to be for a while, but without the hint of the figure there, I don't feel I'm taking a risk. That the figure is the moment of humiliation for me. And I mean that kind of in a nice way, like that it has a vulnerability to it. There's a risk there. And so a lot of my process is trying to figure out an oblique way of building an image, so that it isn't resolved too fast or too quick or too easy for me, that I'm not stating the figure directly or clearly delineating it from the beginning, because to me that feels really thin, and I want something that's really physical and built, and so I'm looking for ways to challenge myself. Contemporary artists that I really admire, Charlene Von Hale, whose work is quite abstract, but there's a lecture that you can hear online through the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, and she talks about how her process of painting is almost like printmaking, where she'll have one layer and then kind of print another layer on top of it, and how each layer that she's making is a violation of the previous layer. And that vocabulary is really helpful to me in thinking about that. So instead of painting to what is already there and developing what is already there, so knowing what the image is from the beginning, instead of that, actually violating what is there so that the image, the resulting image, is actually a tension between forces. And that's something that's really important to me. It has to be this thing, but it also has to be this other thing. And I mean that formally and in terms of subject matter, so that it both has to be an interesting series of colored shapes, and it has to be this narrative that's happening. And so every time I'm making a mark, it needs to be both of those things. But the moment that it becomes too unified, I'm not interested, because then it's only one thing. Or that might sound a little out there, but it really is about creating tension between forces for me. The second it becomes unified too much or too far, then to me there's an urgency that it lacks, that there's, the energy is kind of, I don't know, falls out of the picture plane. I mean, like you guys said, there's, every painting has its own unique process to it, I think, but we can kind of think about process and recognize our own patterns with it. But it's kind of a strange thing, the idea of even talking about process, because I think so much of it is intuitive. But we can make statements about seeing our own pattern through time, how our images have developed.
But the Billboard was, what I learned from it is I have the Billboard itself was donated by Ackley Communications. They went out of business. They were bought up by Clear Channel. Clear Channel wasn't so interested in working with me as Ackley was. And they didn't communicate with me very well at all. And I kept trying to figure out, I said, you know, this, I would like to have my billboard here, or these, I gave them some options. And they just never got back to me. And finally, I was teaching that at that point, and the student said, is your billboard a baby? I'm like, oh, yeah, where, is it up? And a student actually had to tell me that the billboard was up. They didn't tell me that it was up. They put it up on Aurora, but they put it up really close to an abortion clinic. And on the back, they put a Right to Life poster. Yeah, so they essentially used my image for their ends, which didn't make me happy. And so there was I think it was Amy Jagus for The Stranger, yeah. She wrote an article about it. You can see here's the Right to Life poster. That was on the back. I was actually being interviewed by Regina Hackett about this, and I was telling her about it. And Amy had already contacted Clear Channel, was talking to them about it, and they pulled it down. So Regina went out there and she said, oh, there's no billboard on the back. I mean, it had already been documented, so she said, oh, well, that's no story. But anyway, so Amy got the story. But the point of it is that so in terms of process, and that was the first time I'd ever done anything like that, and the billboard company was bought out in the middle of my process, and one billboard company had way different agenda than the other. And so if you're doing public art, which I've done almost none, really, you have to be really careful to maintain control and to get more money so that you can pay for the billboard, so then they don't have any power over the image, I guess. But so that's pretty much the story of that. that was a while ago. So in terms of process, you don't always have control, I guess, of what happens with your image or how someone might use it if you're, you know, if you become vulnerable to someone else's ideas.
You mentioned, it was brought up, Kimberly referenced it, how do you know when you're done? You probably want to say that one doesn't know how far enough is until one's gone too far. Otherwise you never know. That's why people fall off cliffs, I guess. So the art of it is how do I get back? Have you ever? I recall just after Johnny Cash died, there were a lot of radio programs. One was a documentary. It had him in the studio, and the recording engineer came down to him and said, Johnny, you nailed that just right. And he listened to it and said, no, I got to go back and rough it up. But it's and that roughing it up often is the hardest damn thing there is to do. But perhaps you can reference some of that.
I'll talk.
Sure.
That happens all the time, and that's my biggest fear, is overdoing it and saying too much. When that does happen, what I do is take some sandpaper out and sand it down, and a lot of times I'll paint a really obnoxious color over it, cad red, like this color, right on top of it, just to get it out of there, and then I'll start fresh, let it sit for a few days and start fresh. And it always takes me a long time to get to that point because it's scary to do. But in the end, it feels really great to paint over this struggle that you've had. And it is a process, so you can't get, in the end, if it works out, you had to have that struggle, you had to paint through that to get to the end point. So I don't think of it as wasted time or effort in any sense.
Yeah, that could be really important for that to happen.
Yeah.
And in some ways, overdoing it and knowing where that line is very clearly is wonderful. So that then you're brave again. You say, wow, you're overdone. I'm going to violate you.
Yeah.
And then knock you back into something else. But yeah, it's not wasted time because that energy put into that sanding down or building back up recreates it in, I think, a way more complex or interesting way.
And in some ways, like you were just mentioned, you tackle it differently. You don't, in the beginning, if it's going well and it keeps going well, you're kind of always, oh, it's going well, I hope I don't mess it up, and you get really careful, and that's a bad place to be sometimes. So sometimes the best thing for it is to get into some tricky situations that kind of force you to have to take some risks and make some big changes, and then everything becomes a little less precious, and you're not as scared to kind of go through and really do what needs to be done. Take care of
In
business.
some ways, the worst thing for me is walking into the studio the next day with a couple paintings that are working. Like, then what do you do?
Yeah.
Like, if I have a painting that is not working, then yay, I get a party that day. I get to have fun. I get to tackle it. I get to
Yeah, it's
work.
work.
Yeah. So I like leaving at the end of the day with things that being a disaster. Because then I know I get to work again tomorrow. I love that. And I want that, it's like a constant battle between it working and not working. So I don't, in some ways it's like it doesn't really happen just once in the process, like this constant battle of not letting it work.